Hey guys, tonight we're going deep, really deep, into one particular, often heartbreaking corner of the medieval world. Forget everything else for now. For the next couple of hours, we are going to immerse ourselves completely in understanding just why it truly, comprehensively, and often brutally sucked to be a medieval widow. This isn't a footnote in history. For countless women, it was a life sentence, a daily battle fought in the shadows of towering cathedrals and muddy village lanes. So, before you settle under those covers, and let the quiet of your room embrace you, if you appreciate these deep dives into the historical gloom, maybe give that like button a thoughtful tap, and perhaps consider subscribing. But only if this particular brand of sleepy historical suffering is your cup of tea. We're not here for the knights in shining armor tonight, unless they're the ones making a widow's life miserable. And you know I love to hear this. Where are you listening from tonight, and what hour has the relentless march of time brought you to? It's a strange kind of comfort, knowing our little global coven of historical insomniacs is out there, listening together in the dark, perhaps finding a strange sort of peace in these tales of bygone woe. Alright then, dim those lights just a little bit more. Find that perfect hum from your fan or the distant city, and let's very, very carefully begin to unwrap the tightly bound, often blood-stained story of the medieval widow. It's a tapestry woven with threads of grief, resilience, injustice, and the quiet, desperate, unending fight for simple survival. The silence in the room is a physical thing. It presses down on you, heavier than the thickest woolen blanket. Just moments ago, that same room was filled with the ragged, painful, rattling breaths of your husband. The man who was, for better or worse, the center of your small universe. Now, just nothing. An abrupt, terrifying still. LNESS. The women of the household, your sisters perhaps, if they live close by, or your grown daughters, their faces already etched with a sorrow that mirrors your own. Or maybe just trusted female servants, their movements hushed and practiced in the rituals of death. They move with a kind of hushed efficiency. Someone gently closes his eyes, a final act of tenderness in a world that often lacked it. Another might carefully tie a strip of clean linen beneath his chin, to keep his jaw from falling slack in a way that seems unseemly, even in death. They will wash his body, a last service, a final act of intimacy and respect. The water will be cold, the soap, if you have any, harsh and unscented. Then they will shroud him in a simple linen sheet, probably the best one you own, saved for just such an occasion, though you never truly believed it would come so soon, or perhaps you always feared it would. You watch all this, or maybe you don't. Maybe you've stumbled away, collapsed, onto a hard wooden stool in the darkest corner of the chamber. The sounds of their ministering, the splash of water, the rustle of linen, their whispered prayers or quiet weeping, reaching you as if from a great distance, muffled and dreamlike. The room, his sickbed chamber, suddenly feels vast, alien, and terrifyingly empty. The lingering scent of sickness, of stale sweat, of herbal remedies that ultimately failed, of death itself, mingles with the sharp, almost clean smell of beeswax from the candles that someone has hastily lit. They burn with a steady, unwavering flame, meant to ward off, well, who knows what they're meant to ward off? Evil spirits, the encroaching darkness, or maybe they're just a small, defiant spark of light in the face of an overwhelming void. Superstitions are as thick in the air as the smell of dying herbs. Windows might be flung open even in the dead of winter, to allow the departed spirit a clear path to wherever it's going. Mirrors might be covered, say they trap the soul, or show a reflection of something no one wants to see. Your role, in these first raw hours, is to grieve, and not just to feel it, in the quiet, shattered privacy of your own heart. Oh no, you must perform it. Loudly, visibly. Medieval society had strong expectations for how a new widow should behave. Wailing, crying out, even tearing at your hair and clothes. These were not uncommon, and in some communities almost obligatory demonstrations of sorrow. For a noblewoman, Lady Eleanor, perhaps a more restrained, dignified display of grief would be expected. Quiet tears, a bowed head, a demeanor of profound and graceful sorrow. But the sorrow itself had to be undeniable, a public testament to your loss and your virtue as a loving wife. Your black-dyed woolens, hastily prepared or perhaps already stored away if your husband had been ailing for some time, become your new uniform. They are coarse, itchy, and probably ill-fitting. They smell faintly of the dye vat and something ancient and sad. This dark, heavy fabric will be your constant companion, a physical manifestation of the immense weight that has just irrevocably settled upon your life. The days that crawl by between the death and the funeral are a strange, disorienting limbo. The house, whether it's a drafty manor or a humble cottage, fills with a low murmur of activity, a constant coming and going. Relatives you haven't seen in years arrive, some from considerable distances, their faces carefully composed into masks of sympathy. You scrutinize them. Is their concern genuine, or are their eyes already flicking around the room, assessing the value of your late husband's possessions, calculating their own potential share of any inheritance, weighing your future usefulness to their own ambitions? Who truly mourns with you, and who is merely observing, waiting? These unspoken questions hang in the air, far thicker and more suffocating than the smoke from the central hearth. Food is brow, tea by neighbors and kinswomen, a practical kindness in a world where life, especially the relentless demands of providing food, must go on, even in the immediate aftermath of death. Small loaves of bread, a piece of cheese, a pot of stew. You likely have no appetite. The very thought of eating seems a betrayal, an obscenity. Sleep, when it comes, is a fleeting, troubled visitor, populated by nightmares and an aching sense of absence. The empty space beside you in the bed, it's a cold, hard reminder of everything you've lost. Then the funeral itself. This is rarely just a private family affair, especially if your husband was a man of any standing in the community. It's a public statement, a social ritual. The status of your late husband, and by extension the ongoing status of his family, your family now, in a fractured sort of way, is on display for all to see. If he was a man of importance, a knight like Sir Robert, or a wealthy merchant in a thriving town, the procession to the sea. Church will be as elaborate as the estate can afford, or perhaps even more elaborate than it can truly afford, in a final desperate show of dignity. Priests in their vestments, chanting mournful psalms, acolytes swinging censers, the fragrant acrid smoke billowing upwards, supposedly carrying prayers to heaven. Mourners, hired or genuine, clad in dark, sober robes. You, as the widow, are the chief mourner. Your grief, your comportment, is the centerpiece of this somber public pageant. You walk slowly, heavily veiled perhaps, your eyes downcast, leaning on the arm of a male relative, your son, your brother and uncle, because a woman, especially a grieving one, is not expected to stand entirely alone. The church service itself, it's a long, solemn, and often intimidating affair. The priest, a figure of immense authority, intones the Latin Mass for the dead. The words, unless you are one of the very few women of your time who has received a classical education, are largely incomprehensible. But the atmosphere, the flickering candlelight on the stone walls, the somber tones of the plainsong chant, the stern painted eyes of saints staring down from the altar screen, the pervasive smell of old incense and damp stone, it all combines to create an overwhelming sense of awe and perhaps of judgment. Dust to dust, ashes to ashes. The finality of it all presses down on you, as heavy and unyielding as the cold stone arches of the church itself. The burial, whether in the hallowed but often crowded earth of the churchyard, amidst the leaning, weathered headstones of generations past, or for the very wealthy and influential, a family tomb or chantry chapel within the sacred walls of the church itself, is another wrenching moment of farewell. That sound, the dull, hollow thud of earth hitting the wooden coffin, or the grating slide of a stone slab being levered into place, it's a sound that will burrow deep into your memory. A sound that will return to haunt your sleepless nights for years to come. Each shovelful, each rasp of stone on stone, feels like another nail being hammered into the coffin of your old life. And after the solemnities of the burial, there might be a funeral feast, or at least a gathering where food and drink are offered to the mourners. It's not a celebration, of course. It's a ritualized sharing, a communal acknowledgement of loss, and perhaps a subtle reaffirmation of the social order. Another duty for you to endure. You sit there, veiled and sorrowful, picking at the food you cannot taste, listening to the hushed conversations around you, as life, for everyone else, begins the slow, inexorable process of regrouping, of moving on. But for you, the medieval widow, the real ordeal, the long, hard slog of your new existence is only just beginning. The last of the mourners eventually shuffles away. The house falls into an unnerving quiet, and it's in that quiet, that suddenly empty space, that the full, crushing weight of your situation starts to land. You are a widow, and in medieval Europe, that meant you were immediately, and often brutally, plunged into a legal and economic quagmire that could swallow you whole. First things first, where are you going to live? And what, in God's name, are you going to live on? If you are Lady Eleanor, whose late husband, Sir Robert, held his lands as a knight of some standing, you are, by the common law of places like England, entitled to your dower. We've touched on this, but let's be clear. This is typically the right to use and derive income from 1/3 of your husband's lands for the rest of your natural life. It's crucial to understand this. It's not outright ownership in the modern sense. You generally can't sell your dower lands, or mortgage them, or leave them to someone in your own will. They revert to your husband's heir upon your death. It's a life interest, a provision designed in theory to support you, to keep you from being cast out into utter destitution, a burden on the parish or your kinsfolk. You are also, again by law, supposed to have your quarantine. This is the right to remain in your husband's principal dwelling, his main manor house for instance, for a period of 40 days after his death. During this time, you are to be maintained from the existing stores of the household, the food in the larder, the ale in the cellar, the firewood in the stack, and within these 40 days your dower is meant to be formally assigned to you. This was a hugely important protection, famously enshrined in Clause 7 of Magna Carta in 1215, which was reissued many times. It was a clear recognition by the highest powers in the land that a widow shouldn't be instantly evicted, left homeless and penniless the moment her husband's eyes were closed. The Great Charter stated, "A widow, after the death of her husband, shall forthwith and without difficulty have her marriage portion and her inheritance, and she shall have her or of the third part of all the lands of her husband which were his in his lifetime, unless she were endowed with less at the church door." It even specified crucially that she could remain in his house for 40 days, within which her dower should be assigned, and that she should have reasonable estovers, that is, her necessary provisions, from the common stock of the estate. Sounds pretty clear-cut, doesn't it? Almost generous for the time. A legal safety net. But as any medieval widow could tell you, the gap between the elegant Latin of a royal charter and the harsh, grasping reality of local power politics could be a vast, dark, and treacherous chasm. Those 40 days of quarantine, they're not just for sitting quietly with your grief, stitching mourning bands. Oh no, they are 40 days of rapidly dwindling resources and escalating anxiety. They are 40 days when the sharks, in the form of your late husband's male relatives, start circling, their fins cutting through the murky waters of your bereavement. Your husband's heir, perhaps it's your own son if he's already a grown man, or if your children are young, or if you had no sons, it might be Robert's ambitious younger brother, your Uncle Geoffrey, who has been waiting in the wings for years. This heir is now, technically, the owner of the entire estate, and while he is legally obligated to assign you your dower, the manner in which he does so, the quality of the lands he chooses for you, the speed with which he acts, all of these are open to interpretation and manipulation. What if he's deliberately slow about assigning your dower? What if those 40 days stretch into 50, then 60? Each passing day eats further into those reasonable estovers. The steward, who now answers only to the heir, might suddenly find that the granary is nearly empty, the ale barrels mysteriously dry, the woodpile depleted faster than usual. "Terribly sorry, my lady," he might say, "not quite meeting your but the estate's resources are strained at present." You start to feel the pinch, the silent pressure, and when the dower is finally grudgingly assigned, what if the lands you receive are the poorest, least productive third of the estate, that boggy north field that never drains properly, the thin, overgrazed pasture on the windswept hill, the patch of woodland that's already been stripped of all its decent timber by the heir himself? The law said a third part. It didn't always specify a fair third part in terms of quality or income potential, and proving that you've been deliberately shortchanged. That's a monumental legal battle you probably can't afford and don't have the stomach for. Imagine Lady Eleanor, perhaps unlettered in the arcane language of charters and the practicalities of land surveys, being presented with a crudely drawn map by Uncle Geoffrey and the estate steward, a man whose loyalty has clearly shifted with the wind. "There you are, my dear Eleanor," Geoffrey says, his voice oozing a sympathy that doesn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Your dower, the North Field, a bit damp, I'm afraid, but Robert always said he was going to get around to draining it one of these years. And the old woods down by the Blackwater stream, rather thin, unusable timber these days, unfortunately, but very secluded for your contemplative walks. And of course the small bailiff's cottage by the west gate will make a cozy enough residence for you, as the manor house itself is, well, far too large and costly for a lady on her own to maintain, and young Robert, the rightful heir, naturally needs it for his own growing family, you understand. The small bailiff's cottage. What happened to Magna Carta and the chief house for your quarantine, and likely for your dower residence if it was part of the dower lands? Already the chipping away, the downgrading begins. And that boggy Northfield, those depleted woods, are they truly a fair and reprise, and third of a knight's prosperous estate? Or are they the dregs, the leftovers, carefully carved out to minimize your income, your influence, your very ability to live with any degree of comfort or dignity? You suspect the latter. But what can you do to fight this? You need knowledge you probably don't possess. You need powerful allies, which you may no longer have now your husband is gone. You need power. And power, for a medieval woman, was a very scarce commodity. If your late husband was a tenant of a particularly powerful and just lord, that lord might take an interest in ensuring you receive your due, partly to ensure the estate remains viable and can continue to provide its feudal services, but just as often, the lord's interest might be in keeping the main estate as large and productive as possible for the heir, who is, after all, his new vassal and future source of military service or revenue. Your needs as the dowager widow might be seen as secondary, even a burden, on the estate's future prosperity. He might subtly or not so subtly pressure you to accept a smaller dower or a less convenient arrangement, for the good of the estate, of course. And so you might find yourself in court. Which court, you ask? Well, that depends entirely on your social standing and the nature of your dispute. For many peasant or villain widows like our goodwife Agnes, whose dower might consist of that smoky one-room cottage and a few scattered, sun-baked strips of land in the village's open fields, the manorial court is the first and often the only port of call. This court, usually held in the manor hall, or even outdoors under a large tree if the weather was fine, was presided over by the lord of the manor himself, or, more commonly, his steward or reeve. It dealt with local land tenure, breaches of manorial custom, petty debts, and minor assaults. Here, the unwritten custom of the manor was often as important, if not more so, than any formal right and law. If the custom of your particular manor was generally favorable to widows, and if the lord or his steward was a reasonably just man, or at least not actively hostile or in league with your grasping relatives, Agnes might get a fair hearing. She could stand before the court, perhaps with a male kinsman to speak for her if she was too intimidated or inarticulate, and state her claim to her late husband John's holding. But the jurors in this court, the men who advised the lord or steward on the custom and the facts of the case, were other villagers, her neighbors, men who might themselves have an eye on her little plot of land if she should falter, men who might owe favors to the heir. It was a very local, very personal, and often very biased system. For Lady Eleanor, a dispute over a knight's fee or the boundaries of substantial dower lands was a much more serious and expensive affair. She might find herself having to bring a case in the county court, or even in one of the King's Central Courts at Westminster, the Court of Common Pleas, which dealt with disputes between subjects, or perhaps even the King's Bench, if a matter of royal interest was involved. This meant travel, which was slow, dangerous, and costly. It meant expenses, court fees, lodging, food for herself and any attendants. And most dauntingly, it meant hiring lawyers, or rather attorneys, who would manage the case, and pleaders, who would actually argue it in court. These men were a special breed, steeped in the arcane, almost mystical languages of the law. Latin and a peculiar dialect known as Law French How do you, a noblewoman perhaps educated in polite French and a little devotional Latin, but certainly not in the dense thickets of legal jargon, effectively instruct these men? How do you ensure they are truly fighting for your best interests, and not just racking up exorbitant fees, or worse, striking a comfortable backroom deal with the opposing side that leaves you with pennies on the pound? The entire system was designed to be intimidating, alienating, and ruinously expensive for any but the wealthiest and most determined litigants. Many widows, even those of considerable initial means, were utterly ruined by the staggering cost and endless delays of trying to secure their rightful dower through the king's courts. Justice had a very high price tag, and then, piled on top of all this legal wrangling and emotional turmoil, there was the ever-present specter of your late husband's debts. This was a huge, terrifying fear for most widows, while English common law, to its credit, did offer a significant degree of protection to a widow's dower lands from her husband's commercial creditors, meaning debts he incurred in business dealings. It wasn't an absolute shield against all claims, and this protection varied across Europe. Moreover, there were other types of financial obligations that could descend upon the estate like a plague of locusts. We've already mentioned the hariat, that feudal death duty owed to the overlord. This wasn't a polite request for a token sum. It was a serious claim, often on the most valuable and easily seized assets of the deceased's estate. For a great nobleman, the hariat might be several war horses, suits of armor, silver plate. For a lesser knight like Sir Robert, it might be his best charger, his personal sword and shield, and a substantial cash payment. For a prosperous peasant, it might be his best ox or cow. These were not trivial amounts. The lord's agent would arrive, often with alarming speed after the funeral, to claim these dues, and they had to be paid promptly. This could strip the estate of vital working capital or essential livestock before you, the widow, had even had a chance to assess what was left or secure your own portion. And what about other debts? Personal loans your husband took out, unpaid bills to merchants and tradesmen, gambling debts perhaps that he never mentioned, suddenly. While creditors you never knew existed might emerge from the woodwork, waving IOUs and promissory notes, some genuine, some perhaps less so. The heir, eager to clear the estate of encumbrances so he can enjoy his inheritance, might be keen to pay off these debts, but using which assets, he might try to argue that certain properties you believed were part of your dower pool should instead be sold to satisfy these claims. Or he might simply let the creditors besiege you, arguing that as the widow, you bear some responsibility for your husband's financial imprudence. It was a financial minefield. You're trying to calculate the true worth of the estate, identify what is legally yours, fend off opportunistic claims, all while still reeling from the shock of bereavement and trying to manage a household that has just lost its primary provider. The emotional toll of facing potential financial ruin, of seeing your future security unravel before your eyes, on top of the profound grief of losing our husband, it's almost unimaginable. The psychological shock of these first weeks and months, it cannot be overstated. One day, you are a wife. You have a place, a role, a certain, albeit often circumscribed degree of security and protection within the patriarchal structure of medieval marriage. The next day, you are adrift. Your protector, your partner, your master, he is gone. Your economic future is suddenly terrifyingly uncertain. Your social standing, once anchored by his, is diminished, ambiguous. You are abruptly, and often unwillingly, thrust into a position of sole responsibility, not just for your own survival, but frequently for that of your young, bewildered, and now fatherless children. And you have to face all these complex legal battles, all these pressing financial demands, often against men who are more educated in the ways of the world, more legally astute, more powerful, and far less inclined to be sympathetic than their initial, carefully worded condolences. GHT have suggested. The black veil of widowhood wasn't just a symbolic piece of cloth you wore on your head. It was a suffocating shroud of legal complexities, financial anxieties, and profound social vulnerabilities that could, and often did, crush even the strongest and most resilient of spirits. And this, dear listener, this agonizing, bewildering descent into a world of uncertainty and struggle, was just the very beginning of your long, hard journey as a medieval widow. The fight for your very survival had only just begun. All right, Lady Eleanor. Against all odds, through a combination of sheer grit, perhaps a sliver of luck, or maybe, just maybe because your late Sir Robert was an unusually organized man who left a meticulously clear will, you've actually managed to secure your dower. You now have your legal third of the lands, a roof over your head, perhaps even the main manor house if your son, the new heir, is still a child under your guardianship, or if he's an exceptiona, rare example of a considerate adult offspring. You have a source of income, however modest or hard-won, from your tenants and the produce of your dower estate. You can finally breathe a tiny, quavering sigh of relief, can't you? Perhaps settle into a life of quiet, respectable, dignified widowhood, tending your lands and your soul. Oh, my dear lady, if only it were that simple. For a noble or gentry widow in the high or late Middle Ages, securing your dower wasn't the end of the battle. It was merely the end of the first brutal campaign. Your gilded cage of rank and landed property, which might have seemed a source of security, came with a whole new set of intricate, often invisible shackles. First off, let's talk about the sheer, unadulterated work of managing that estate. This wasn't some passive income stream where you could just recline on a chaise longue, if they'd been invented yet, which they hadn't, and have bags of silver coin delivered to your door. Oh no, medieval estates, even modest ones, were complex, labor-intensive businesses. And now, you were the CEO, the farm manager, the accountant, and the chief legal officer all rolled into one, often without any prior training for any of those roles. You had agricultural lands to oversee. Was the three-field system being correctly implemented? Were the plowing teams doing their job, or were they skiving off in the village alehouse? Was the land being properly manured with marl or dung to maintain its fertility, or was it being slowly exhausted? Were the crop yields, wheat, barley, oats, rye, perhaps some peas or beans, what they should be, or were they suspiciously low this season? You had livestock, a vital part of the estate's economy, and your own larder. Sheep for their precious wool, a major cash crop in England. Cattle for meat, milk, and traction. Pigs for everything from bacon to bristles. Were they healthy? Were they being adequately pastured and foddered? Were your shepherds and herdsmen honest and diligent? Or were a few too many lambs disappearing before they were counted? You had tenants, and medieval tenants came in all shapes and sizes, each with their own set of rights and obligations. Some were free tenants, holding their land by charter, paying a fixed cash rent, perhaps owing some nominal services. Others were villains, unfree peasants tied to the manor, who owed you not just rents in kind, a certain number of chickens at Christmas, a bushel of oats at Michaelmas, a few dozen eggs at Easter, but also, crucially, labor services. They had to work on your demesne land, the part of the estate you farmed directly for your own profit, for a set number of days each week, and perhaps extra days during busy periods like plowing or harvest. These were called boon works. Were they all showing up for their required labor? Were they doing a decent day's work, or just leaning on their hoes and gossiping? If someone defaulted on their rent or failed to perform their services, what were you going to do about it? You couldn't just march down to their hut and demand satisfaction. You'd have to summon them to your own manorial court. Imagine that. You, Lady Eleanor, a woman, presiding over a court, listening to disputes, levying fines, making judgments over men who might resent your authority simply because of your gender. It required a will of iron, a deep understanding of local custom, and a very, very thick skin. Then there was the physical infrastructure of the estate. The manor house itself, even if it wasn't a grand castle, was probably a rambling, drafty stone or timber-framed building that was always in need of repair. A leaking roof here, a crumbling wall there, a chimney that smoked out the entire hall. Mills, water mills for grinding grain, perhaps a fulling mill if you were in a wool-producing area, were vital assets, but they needed constant, skilled maintenance. Fish ponds, which provided a crucial source of protein, especially during Lent, needed to be kept clean and properly stocked. Hedges and fences around fields and pastures needed mending to keep livestock in and poachers out. All of this cost money, required skilled labor, and demanded your constant attention and organization. You had to hire carpenters, masons, thatchers. You had to purchase timber, stone, lime. You had to keep accounts or find a steward or reeve who was both competent and, more importantly, honest enough to do it for you. And then you had to supervise him to make sure he wasn't lining his own pockets at your expense. Remember Christine de Pizan, that remarkable woman of letters from the late 14th and early 15th centuries. She wasn't just writing poetry and allegories. In works like the Book of the Body Politic, and especially The Treasure of the City of Ladies, she gave very practical advice to women of the aristocracy, including princesses and noblewomen. She knew that their education often left them woefully unprepared for the realities of managing property or wielding authority. She wasn't just talking about the importance of needlework and piety. She advised them that they needed to understand governance, the principles of good estate management, financial accounting, even basic military strategy, if their husbands were away at war, or if they found themselves widowed and responsible for defending their lands. She wrote of the wise lady who will wish to know in detail about the state and condition of her lands, how much they are worth a year in revenue, how many vassals and tenants she has, what rights of justice she holds over them. She urged them to be well informed about all her rights so that no one can cheat her or seize what is hers. Sound advice. But for most medieval noblewomen, raised primarily to be modest, obedient, and accomplished in the domestic arts, acquiring this level of practical knowledge and assertive capability was a monumental, often terrifying undertaking. You had to learn on the job, in the full glare of public scrutiny, and your mistakes could have devastating consequences for yourself and your children. And your reeve or steward, that key man on the ground, the one who supposedly implemented your decisions and managed the daily operations of the estate, was he truly loyal to you, the dowager lady, the temporary holder of the dower lands, or was his real allegiance, his long-term future, tied to the heir, your young son perhaps, or your ambitious brother-in-law, who would one day inherit these lands fully and become his permanent master? He might outwardly defer to you, call you my lady, but inwardly resent taking orders from a woman. He might subtly sabotage your efforts, misrepresent accounts, neglect repairs, or quietly divert the best produce or livestock for the heir's benefit, or even his own. You had to be constantly vigilant, endlessly questioning, perpetually trying to assert your authority in a world that fundamentally believed wrong, and had no real authority, only that which was temporarily delegated to them by men, or held in trust for their male children. Now let's talk more about that heir. If it's your own son and he's still a minor, under the age of 21, or sometimes 14 for certain purposes, you, as his mother, might be his legal guardian. This often meant you would manage his entire inheritance, not just your dower portion, until he came of age. This could give a widow considerable de facto power and influence. She could make decisions about his education, his property, even to some extent his future marriage. But it also came with immense responsibility, and made her an even more attractive target for manipulation and exploitation. Other powerful families, or even the king, might try to gain control of your son's wardship and marriage. The wardship of a wealthy orphaned heir was a valuable commodity in the feudal world. It could be bought and sold. The guardian not only controlled the lands and their income during the heir's minority, though they were supposed to manage it responsibly and not commit waste, but they also had the right to arrange the heir's marriage, a right that could be sold for a hefty sum to a family eager to secure a rich spouse for their own child. The king himself often sold off these profitable wardships to the highest bidder, or granted them as favors to his loyal supporters, with precious little concern for the well-being of the child or the wishes of the widowed mother. Your son's childhood, his future happiness, the very lands he was to inherit, all could become pawns in a cynical game of feudal finance and power politics. You would have to fight, often desperately, to retain guardianship of your own child and protect his inheritance from predatory guardians. If your son was already of age when your husband died, or if the heir was a brother-in-law, a nephew, or some other male relative, your dower lands were, in essence, carved out of his estate. He was waiting in the wings. He might respect your life interest, as the law required, Or he might see your dower as an intolerable inconvenience, a constant drain on his rightful income and resources. He's just waiting for you to die so he can get that land back under his full control. It's not exactly a recipe for warm family relations, is it? He might engage in a campaign of petty harassment. His men might accidentally let their cattle graze on your dower meadows. He might dispute your customary rights to cut timber for fuel in the estate woodlands, or to fish in the manor pond. He might challenge your collection of fines or dues from your manorial court, claiming those rights belong to him as the true lord of the fee. His aim, to make your life so difficult, so unpleasant, that you'll eventually agree to a less favorable settlement, perhaps a smaller, consolidated block of land that's easier for him to manage around, or even a fixed cash annuity instead of the land. Itself, an annuity that might not keep pace with rising prices, and which would strip you of the direct connection to the land and the status that came with it. The Paston family letters, those incredible documents from 15th century England, are an absolute goldmine for understanding these brutal realities. Agnes Paston, widowed in 1444, and her even more famous daughter-in-law, Margaret Paston, widowed in 1466, were formidable, resilient women. They weren't shrinking violets. They had to be nails. They fought tooth and nail for decades to protect their families' lands and their own dower rights against powerful predatory neighbors, rival claimants, and even against internal family disputes. Margaret Paston in particular is a figure of awe. While her husband John was often away in London dealing with lawsuits, she managed their Norfolk estates, dealt with difficult tenants, oversaw repairs to their properties, raised their children, and famously organized the armed defense of Ca. Castle when it was besieged by the Duke of Norfolk. These women wrote endless letters, managing finances by correspondence, going to court in person when necessary, negotiating with hard-bitten lawyers and powerful aristocrats. They were incredibly capable, resourceful, and courageous, but their lives were a constant, exhausting battle, a never-ending series of crises and anxieties. And remember, Agnes Paston was even known to have had her own daughter, Elizabeth Paston, physically beaten by her mother's chaplain to try and force her into a good, financially and socially advantageous marriage she was resisting. It was a tough, unsentimental world, and noblewomen, including widows, had to be incredibly tough, even ruthless at times, just to survive and protect what was theirs. But perhaps the single greatest, most relentless, and most personally invasive pressure on a noble or gentry widow, especially if she was relatively young, still of childbearing age, and crucially held significant lands through her dower or as guardian for a minor heir, was the pressure to remarry. And this was rarely, if ever, about your personal happiness, your desire for companionship or finding love again. Oh no, this was about property, power, and politics. You see, your dower lands, your person, your very womb, and its potential to bear more heirs. You, Lady Eleanor, were now an asset, a very valuable and very vulnerable commodity on the feudal marriage market. Your own family, your father, if he was still alive, your brothers, your powerful uncles, they might look at your widowed state not with unalloyed sympathy, but with a calculating eye. Eleanor, my dear, your ambitious brother might say, his voice carefully modulated with concern, Lord Fitzwalter has made discreet inquiries. A most suitable connection. He's a man of considerable influence at court, you know. Such an alliance would be of immense benefit to our family's standing, and his lands march conveniently with yours, which would be most efficient to manage. He's not particularly bothered by the fact that Lord Fitzwalter is old enough to be your father, has a face like a gargoyle, 3 grasping sons from his first marriage, who will undoubtedly resent you, and a notorious reputation for beating his servants. No, your brother is thinking about the lands Fitzwalter controls, the influence he wields with the king, the advantages that would accrue to him and his line from such a match. Your personal feelings are a triviality, and your feudal overlord, or the king himself, if you held your lands directly from the crown as a tenant-in-chief, they had an even bigger and more legally enforceable say in your remarriage. They couldn't, strictly speaking by canon law, force you to marry a specific person entirely against your declared will. The church, to its credit, generally insisted on the consent of both parties for a valid marriage. But they could, and frequently did, make a life utterly unbearable if you refused their strong suggestions or tried to make your own choice. They held the right of maritigium, the right to control your marriage. They could withhold their consent for any marriage they didn't approve of. And if you dared to marry without that essential royal or seigneurial license, especially if you were a significant heiress or a wealthy dowager, you could face truly crippling fines, the temporary or even permanent confiscation of your lands, or worse, your body, your future, your property. They were not entirely your own to dispose of. The remarriage market for wealthy widows was a brutal, cynical business. Your value was not in your wit, your charm, or your kindness. It was calculated in acres of arable land, in the number of knights' fees your dower represented, in the strategic importance of your castles, in the political connections your name could bring, your personal feelings, your grief for your lost husband, your hopes for your own future. They were inconvenient footnotes if they were considered at all. Look at the historical records. So many noble widows remarried with what seems to modern eyes like unseemly, almost indecent haste. Was it always their eager choice, or was it because the relentless pressure from their families, from their lords, from the sheer naked precariousness of being a woman alone with valuable property, in a predatory world, was simply too much to bear for long? Some widows did try to resist this inexorable pressure. Some, like the formidable Elizabeth de Burgh, Lady of Clare in the 14th century, widowed 3 times by the age of 26, and one of the wealthiest women in England, managed, through a combination of immense personal wealth, shrewd political maneuvering, and sheer force of will, to navigate multiple widowhoods and remain largely in control of her own destiny, eventually choosing a life of influential dowagerhood and becoming a great patron of learning and religion. She founded Clare College, Cambridge. But she was utterly exceptional, a woman of almost royal standing and vast independent resources. For most noble widows, the choices were far more constrained, the outcomes far less certain. If you were young and considered beautiful, that was another kind of snare, another layer of vulnerability. Your beauty might make you desirable as a bride, but it also made you a prime target for abduction and forced marriage, a surprisingly not uncommon occurrence in the more lawless periods or regions of medieval Europe. Your dower, your inheritance, was the true prize, your consent a mere formality to be extracted later, if at all. What if you actually wanted to choose your own second husband, perhaps for love, a rare and precious commodity, or for simple companionship in your lonely widowhood, or because you found a man you genuinely believed would be a kind stepfather to your children and a responsible manager of your lands, if your choice didn't happen to align perfectly with the strategic interests of your powerful family or your feudal lord? You were in for a very rough ride indeed. Catherine Swynford, as we noted, famously became the long-term mistress, and eventually the third wife of the mighty John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, in the 14th century. She was a widow of relatively modest gentry status when their affair began. Their eventual marriage, when it finally happened after the death of Gaunt's second wife, caused a massive scandal. But John of Gaunt was one of the most powerful men in Europe, second only to the king, and he was able to make it stick and have their Beaufort children legitimized. Most widows did not have such an overwhelmingly powerful royal duke to champion their unconventional choices. Their defiance was usually met with punishment, not acceptance. Sometimes, a particularly wealthy or determined widow might try to buy her way out of an unwanted or politically dictated remarriage. She could oath, or to pay a hefty fine to her lord for the right to remain single, license to live sole and chaste, or for permission to marry a man of her own choosing, who would also likely have to pay for the privilege. But that, of course, required having access to significant sums of ready cash, which wasn't always easy, even for a landed widow, whose wealth was tied up in fields and livestock, not coin. And if you did remarry, whether by choice or by coercion, what happened to your dower from your first husband? Generally, the law stated that you kept your life interest in those dower lands. They were yours for your lifetime, regardless of subsequent marriages. However, upon your remarriage, your new husband would typically, by the laws of coverture, gain administrative control over your dower property and its income. So, you might find yourself with a new master not only for your person, but also for the very lands that were supposed to guarantee your financial independence and security. As a widow, if your second husband was a prudent manager, this might work out reasonably well. But if he was feckless, a spendthrift, a gambler, or simply a terrible farmer, he could mismanage those dower lands, run them into the ground, squander the income, and there was often precious little you could legally do to stop him until it was too late. You had, in effect, traded one master for another, and perhaps a worse one at that. The convent. Yes, that always remained an option, at least in theory, for the noble widow weary of the world, tired of the grasping hands and the endless strategic marriages, for a woman of deep piety, or one who simply craved peace and security above all else. The cloister could seem like a genuine haven. Here, behind the high stone walls, a widow could live a structured life of prayer, study, and contemplation, secure from unwanted suitors and the endless demands of managing an estate and fending off grasping relatives. She might even, if she was from a powerful family, and brought a substantial dowry to the convent in the form of her lands or annual income, rise to a position of considerable authority within the religious community, perhaps even becoming a prioress or an abbess, wielding a different kind of power. For some women, like Christina of Marciate in 12th century England, who famously fled an unwanted marriage to live as an anchoress and later a prioress, the religious life was a hard-won sanctuary, a deliberate choice for spiritual autonomy. But again, we must remember this wasn't always a completely free choice. A powerful family eager to consolidate an estate or prevent dower lands from being managed by a potentially remarried widow and her new husband might find it very convenient to encourage a widow, particularly if she was young, childless, and pious, to take the veil. Her dower lands might then be persuaded to be gifted to the family's favored monastery, or absorbed back into the main family line, all under the guise of religious devotion and family harmony. So, Lady Eleanor, your life as a noble widow, even one fortunate enough to possess substantial dower lands and a recognized title, is no easy stroll through scented gardens. It's a constant, exhausting, high-stakes negotiation. You are perpetually trying to preserve your inheritance, protect your vulnerable children, maintain your dignity and reputation in a society quick to judge women, and perhaps, if you're incredibly lucky and daring, find a tiny scrap of personal happiness or autonomy. All this while enmeshed in an incredibly complex web of feudal obligations, patriarchal family ambitions, and the unrelenting pressure of a society that sees you, primarily, as a vessel for property, lineage, and strategic alliance. Your gilded cage might have comfortable tapestries on the walls and silver spoons on the table, but the bars are made of very cold, very hard, unyielding iron, and the key to the door is rarely, if ever, placed in your own hand. Now let's strip away the crumbling tapestries, the tarnished silver, and the cold stone walls of the manor house. Forget about fighting for control of vast income-generating estates or navigating the treacherous currents of high-stakes marriage politics. Let's get down to the cold, hard, muddy earth, literally. You are now Goodwife Agnes, a peasant widow in a small, anonymous medieval village, somewhere in the vast green and often unforgiving countryside of England or France or Germany. Your husband, John, the strong, calloused back that helped you wrest a meager, precarious living from your few allotted strips of land, is dead, swept away by a summer fever, a winter cough, or perhaps a freak accident with an ox cart, and your world, which was already a relentless cycle of hard labor and uncertainty, has just become a terrifying, solitary mountain of unending, back-breaking toil. Your dower rights, as a common woman, a villain or cotter tied to the local manor, they exist, in customary law. But they are a pale, often cruel imitation of the landed security a noble widow might, with immense struggle, achieve. If you're lucky, very lucky, you might get to keep the family cottage, your smoky one-room hut, probably built of timber framing with wattle and daub walls that let in every draft. its leaky thatch roof a constant worry, its floor just packed earth that turns to mud in wet weather. And maybe, just maybe, you get to hold on to the small scattered strips of land in the village's great open fields that John farmed. These strips weren't consolidated. They were spread out a bit here, a bit there, reflecting the communal farming system. Usually your right to hold on to even this meager dower was conditional. You had to be able to provide the labor services owed to the lord of the manor for that land. This meant so many days each week, often 3, working on his demesne, his private fields, doing whatever tasks were required: plowing, sowing, weeding, haymaking, harvesting. And then there were often extra boon works demanded at particularly busy times. When John was alive, he did the lion's share of this heavy agricultural labor, the work that truly broke a man's back. Now, with John gone, it's all on you, Goodwife Agnes. Every single back-breaking hour of it. Can you even picture your day? It starts long before the sun even dreams of painting the eastern sky. You're up in the pre-dawn chill, your breath misting in the frigid air of the hut. You stumble in the darkness, trying to coax a flame from the dying embers in the central hearth. The hut is cold, filled with the stale, lingering smell of wood smoke, unwashed human bodies, and maybe the piglet or a few chickens you brought inside last night to protect them from the bitter cold or a prowling fox. You need to prepare something for your children to eat before you face the day, if there is anything substantial to prepare. Pottage, most likely. That endlessly versatile, endlessly monotonous medieval staple. A thin, watery gruel of whatever grains, oats, barley, perhaps a few peas or beans you have managed to store, boiled and reboiled endlessly over the smoky fire. If you're having a good day, maybe there's a scrap of yesterday's dark coarse bread to go with it. Then, if you are fortunate enough to own a cow or perhaps a couple of goats tethered outside, they need milking. Every drop of their milk is precious. For a bit of nourishment for the children, maybe enough to make a small, hard cheese you can trade for something else you desperately need. Like salt or a bit of iron for a mending job. Your tiny garden plot beside the cottage, your curtilage, needs constant wearying attention. Digging, planting, endless weeding, watering by hand from a heavy wooden bucket lugged from the village well or stream, and trying to protect your precious cabbages and onions from scavenging rabbits or the Lord's deer. This little patch of ground is often the difference between your children having something green to eat, or nothing at all. And then, the fields. If you've somehow managed to keep your dower strips, that land needs working. And this isn't some gentle therapeutic gardening we're talking about. This is medieval agriculture, at its most brutal and inefficient. The soil is heavy, often clay-like and difficult to turn. The plow, if you can even get access to one now that John's gone, as plows and the vital ox teams that pulled them were often shared or hired out, is a cumbersome, heavy wooden beast, usually needing a team of 4 or 6 oxen that you almost certainly don't own outright. Who is going to do that heavy plowing for you? Your children are too small to manage such beasts, even if they could get access to them. Hire help. With what money? You have no money. You are the hired help for others, when you're not desperately trying to work your own scraps of land. So you do what you can, with a heavy, long-handled hoe perhaps, or a simple spade if you have one. Turning over the clods of earth, one aching spadeful at a time, planting the precious seed grain by hand, hoping enough of it will germinate and not be eaten by birds or rot in the ground, and then the weeding. Oh, the endless soul-destroying weeding, stooping for hours under the hot summer sun, or in the damp spring chill, your back screaming in protest, your hands raw and blistered. At harvest time it's even worse. Reaping the ripe grain with a heavy curved sickle, stooping and slashing for hour after grueling hour, trying to gather every last precious stalk before the weather turns, then binding the sheaves, stacking them to dry. If you can't manage your strips effectively, if you can't get the plowing done at the right time, or the sowing or the harvesting, the yield will be poor. And if the yield is poor, your children will go hungry. You might not have enough grain to pay the Lord his dues or the priest his tithe. And, if that happens consistently, you will almost certainly lose the land, because you are no longer a profitable tenant from the Lord's perspective. Often a peasant widow would have no choice but to give up most, if not all, of her dower land immediately, perhaps keeping only the cottage and the garden plot, and try to survive by other means. And what did that mean? It meant wage labor. working on the Lord's demesne fields, or for the wealthier peasants in the village who had larger holdings and needed extra hands. For this, as we've said, you get paid a pittance, a few pennies a day if you're lucky, and always less than a man would get for the same work. A treatise on manor management from the 13th century. Walter of Henley's Husbandry even explicitly advised lords to employ women for tasks like dairy work or tending small livestock precisely because they were cheaper. Thanks for that, Walter. So, there you are, out in all weathers, mucking out byres pungent with the smell of animal waste, shearing sheep if you have the strength and skill. The fleece was valuable, but the work was incredibly tough and dirty, helping with the thatching of roofs with reeds or straw, spreading cartloads of manure on the fields with a wooden fork. Whatever work you can find, whatever task will earn you that desperately needed penny or halfpenny. All day long. And what about your children while you're engaged in this relentless drudgery? If they're very young, they might be literally tied to a post inside the hut, or to a piece of furniture, to keep them from wandering into the open fire or the village pond. Or maybe an older daughter, barely more than a child herself, is left in charge, her own childhood cut brutally short. Or perhaps you rely on the sporadic charity of other village women, who are, themselves, buried under their own mountains of work and childcare. It's a constant, terrifying, exhausting juggling act. One slip, one illness, one accident, and your fragile world could collapse entirely. Let's not forget the other essential woman's work that filled every spare moment, from before dawn until well after dusk. Spinning wool or flax into thread, your hands are never still, the spindle whirring almost constantly even as you walk, even as you watch your children. Then, if you have access to a loom, or can pay a neighbor a tiny share of the finished product, weaving that thread into rough, scratchy cloth to make clothes for your family. And then mending those clothes over and over again, until they're more patches than original fabric. Brewing ale. This was a common task for women and a vital one. Ale was a staple of the medieval diet, providing much-needed calories, and because the water was boiled in the brewing process, it was often safer to drink than water from contaminated wells or streams. A widow might be able to sell a little surplus ale to her neighbors, or at the village market if there was one, for a few precious pennies. Fetching water from the village well or the local stream, often a long muddy walk several times a day, with heavy wooden buckets that cut into your shoulders. Gathering firewood, a constant pressing necessity, especially in winter, and often a risky one. You might be allowed to gather fallen branches, by hook or by crook, from the Lord's forest, but if you were caught cutting down live wood, or taking more than your customary share, the punishment could be severe, a heavy fine you couldn't possibly pay, or even a stint in the village stocks for public humiliation. And the food, it's always about the food, or more accurately, the chronic gnawing lack of it. Your diet, and that of your children, is crushingly monotonous and meager. That dark, coarse, heavy bread, often made with rye or barley because wheat was too expensive. That eternal, watery pottage, day in, day out. Maybe, if you're lucky, a few foraged greens or wild mushrooms to add a bit of flavor. A few eggs your scrawny chickens, if the fox hasn't paid a visit. Meat, that's a rare, almost unimaginable luxury for most peasant widows. Perhaps a tiny bit of bacon from the pig you managed to fatten and slaughter in the autumn, carefully salted and smoked, to make it last through the long, lean winter months, if you were lucky enough to have a pig in the first place. The winters, they are a special kind of medieval hell. Your tiny, poorly built hut offers scant protection against the biting winds, the driving snow, the bone-chilling damp. You huddle together with your children, and any small animals you've brought inside for their warmth, as much as their safety, under a pile of ragged blankets or straw. The human lasagna, as some rather bleakly humorous historians have called it. Fuel is desperately scarce. The firewood you gathered so painstakingly in the autumn dwindles with alarming speed. Disease, coughs, fevers, lung ailments, is rampant in these cold, damp, overcrowded conditions. Hunger is a constant dull ache in your belly, a constant whimpering from your children. Many didn't survive the winter, especially the very young, the very old, and the very poor. Like you. And all this relentless, soul-crushing labor, all this gnawing anxiety, without a partner to share the load, to offer a word of comfort, to help make the impossible decisions, to contribute another pair of strong hands to the endless tasks. John's absence is a gaping, unfillable hole, not just in your heart, but in the very fabric of your household's ability to simply survive. You are a lone woman, often with dependent children, in a world that is physically, economically, and socially brutal to those without male protection and support. What about remarriage for you, good wife Agnes? In your world, it's rarely about love, or even companionship. Though those might be hoped for bonuses, it's almost entirely about sheer, desperate, pragmatic survival. Another pair of strong hands to work. The land, another adult body to help earn a few pennies through wage labor. It could quite literally mean the difference between your children eating regularly, or slowly starving. It could mean keeping that precious scrap of dour land, or losing it. But it's a terrifying gamble. You're bringing your children, your incredibly meager possessions, maybe that tiny bit of land if you've managed to hold on to it, to a new man. Will he be kind to your children? Or will he see them merely as extra mouths he doesn't want to feed, or as rivals to his own future offspring? Will he work hard alongside you? Or will he be a lazy drunkard who drinks away what little you manage to scrape together, and perhaps beats you for good measure? You don't have many choices. If a man in the village, perhaps another widower looking for someone to care for his own children, or a younger landless man looking to acquire a ready-made household, however humble, decides he wants you and your late husband's holding, you might not have much say in the matter. The village community, the lord of the manor, even your own surviving relatives, they might all push you into it because a household headed by a lone woman is seen as inefficient, unstable, weak, a burden on the community. The community itself, it can be a double-edged sword. Your neighbors, the other village women, might help in small ways. They might share a bit of surplus food if they have it, a bit of leftover broth, a handful of apples. They might watch your youngest child for an hour while you desperately try to finish a task in the fields. These small kindnesses could be lifelines, but they also watch you, constantly, judging, gossiping. Is Agnes managing her land properly? Is she keeping to herself as a respectable widow should? Is she attracting unwanted attention from the men of the village? Or conversely, is she seen as too aloof, too proud for her station? A lone woman is intensely vulnerable to theft of her meager possessions, vulnerable to physical or sexual abuse, with little recourse to justice, vulnerable to accusations if things go wrong in the village, if milk sours unexpectedly in a neighbor's dairy, or a cow mysteriously dies. Superstition is rife, and a poor isolated widow could easily become a target for blame. Your dower rights, those precious strips of land perhaps recorded in the manorial court roll in your late husband's name, they are only as good as your physical ability to work them, your social ability to defend them against encroachment, and your financial ability to meet the myriad obligations they entail. The rents, the services, the tithes. And for a peasant widow, already burdened with childcare, already worn down by grief and malnutrition, facing the relentless physical demands of medieval farming without a husband's strength and support, those rights often represented not security, but an almost impossible, heartbreaking challenge, a life sentence to endless grinding, thankless and often hopeless toil, just to keep starvation at bay, for one more day, for one more week, for one more harsh winter, and to pray that your children, somehow, survived it with you. Now let's lift our weary gaze from the muddy fields and smoky isolated huts of the medieval village for a while. What if your fate as a widow unfolded not amidst the endless cycle of sowing and reaping, but within the noisy, jostling, and often perilous confines of a bustling medieval town or city? Imagine you are Margaret, and your late husband Thomas wasn't a farmer wrestling with the stubborn earth, but a moderately successful artisan plying his trade. Perhaps he was a baker, his bread renowned throughout your crowded ward for its decent crumb and honest weight, or a skilled cobbler, whose sturdy shoes kept the townsfolk from the worst of the muck in the unpaved streets, or a carpenter, his saws and hammers a familiar sound in the neighborhood. He had a small workshop, perhaps on the ground floor of your timber-framed house, maybe a stall in the bustling central market, or a contract to supply the local monastery or a nobleman's household. He might have had a couple of apprentices, lads learning the trade, sleeping under the eaves. And you were likely right there beside him, an indispensable, if often unacknowledged, part of the enterprise. You probably managed the household accounts, if you were one of the growing number of urban women who had some literacy, or at least a good head for figures and keeping tallies. You served the customers, charming some, haggling with others. You might have managed the apprentices, ensuring they weren't idle or getting into trouble. Perhaps you even learned some essential aspects of the craft yourself, ready to lend a hand when things got busy. Then he dies, suddenly. A swift illness, one of the many fevers that swept through crowded towns, or a tragic accident in his workshop, a slip of a chisel, a falling piece of timber. And just like that, the familiar rhythm of your life, the clatter and bang of the workshop, the comforting smell of baking bread or curing leather or fresh sawed wood, it all shatters. You are Margaret the artisan's widow. Is your new life any less of a daunting prospect than that of your rural sister, Agnes? Well, it's certainly different. And that difference, as always, can cut both ways, offering both unique opportunities and unique, terrifying perils. One of the biggest potential advantages for a widow in a medieval town was the slim but real possibility of continuing her husband's business, at least for a time. Think about it. Thomas's bakery with its ovens and kneading troughs, his carpentry tools painstakingly acquired over years, his shop with its established clientele and goodwill. These are valuable assets, a going concern. And often, as we've said, you, Margaret, would have been deeply involved in that business already. You weren't just a wife. You were often the uncredited business partner. So when Thomas dies, are you just supposed to lock the workshop door, hang a closed sign if such things existed, and sell off the tools and stock for a fraction of their worth to the nearest opportunistic competitor? Often, many medieval guilds, those powerful all-male associations of master craftsmen and merchants that strictly controlled who could practice a trade within the town walls, actually had specific, if often restrictive, provisions for the widows of their deceased members. They weren't always generous, and they were rarely, if ever, designed with your long-term independent success in mind. But these rules existed. They were a crack in the otherwise solid wall of male monopoly. A common scenario was that a widow would be permitted by the guild to continue her husband's craft by courtesy, or for the sake of his soul, or some other such pious phrasing. This right was usually conditional. She might be allowed to keep the workshop running as long as she employed competent journeymen, skilled workers who had completed their apprenticeships but were not yet masters themselves, and supervised the remaining apprentices her husband had taken on. The guild masters, a council of the most established and powerful men in that particular trade, might agree to this for a specified period, perhaps the traditional year and a day, or as long as she remained a widow and, crucially, didn't remarry outside the guild. The underlying idea was partly to provide a temporary means of support for you and your children, ensuring you didn't immediately become a burden on the town's charitable resources. But it was also, and perhaps more importantly, from the guild's perspective, a way to keep the workshop, a valuable economic unit, operational, to ensure any outstanding debts could be paid, and very significantly, to give a son, if you had one, a chance to grow up, complete his own apprenticeship, and eventually take over his father's place as a master craftsman, thus keeping the skill, the tools, the customers, and the profits safely within the guild family. So there you might find yourself, Margaret, the recently bereaved baker's widow. Suddenly, you're not just quietly assisting Thomas or managing the household accounts in the back room. You are in charge. You're up before the earliest rooster crows, not just to get your own household stirring, but to make sure the ovens are fired to the correct temperature, that the journeyman baker isn't drunk from the night before, that the dough is being properly kneaded. You're the one who has to haggle fiercely with the flour merchant over the ever-fluctuating price of grain, or with the wood seller for fuel for your ovens. You're the one who has to ensure the lazy apprentice isn't sleeping in the empty grain sacks or filching pies when your back is turned. You're the one who has to chase down payment from the local lord steward for tea, that massive order of bread for his upcoming feast, knowing that nobles are notoriously slow payers. It's a brutally steep learning curve, and you're scrambling up it while still numb with grief, while trying to manage a bewildered and fatherless household, while every other baker on your street is probably watching you like a hawk, whispering to each other, waiting for you to falter, waiting for you to fail so they can snap up your loyal customers and your prime market stall. It takes guts. It takes brains. It takes an almost superhuman level of energy and determination. Some towns, particularly the larger and more commercially sophisticated ones like London, had specific local customs that could offer urban widows a bit more legal and economic leeway than their rural counterparts. We've mentioned the custom of London before, and for a widow, one of its most significant aspects was often the right to her free bench. This usually meant that a widow had the right to continue living in the marital home for her lifetime, or sometimes for as long as she remained unmarried and chaste, even if the property itself was legally inherited by an heir, like a son or her husband's brother. This was a massive deal in a crowded, expensive medieval city where decent housing was at a premium and rents were high. It meant you weren't immediately homeless, cast out onto the mean streets with your children and your few possessions. London widows also sometimes benefited from more favorable dower rights concerning their husband's movable goods, his stock in trade, his tools, his cash, his household possessions, as opposed to rural widows whose dower was almost exclusively tied to land. This could give an urban widow a bit more liquid capital, a bit more flexibility to keep a business going or to support herself. And what if you, Margaret, were already an established trader in your own right, even while Thomas was alive and plying his own craft? Some medieval towns, again nota, London but also other major trading centers across Europe, recognized the somewhat unusual status of a femme sole trader, or femme sole domestique. This was a married woman who, by local custom, and with her husband's implicit or explicit consent, conducted her own separate business or trade. She could enter into contracts in her own name, buy and sell goods, hire apprentices, and crucially, she could sue and be sued in court as if she were a single woman, and she was responsible for her own business debts, meaning her husband wasn't liable if her ventures went sour, and vice versa. If you had managed to establish yourself as a femme sole, perhaps you were a successful alewife running a popular and hopefully clean tavern, or a skilled seamstress or embroiderer with your own wealthy clients, or a huckster selling fruit or fish or trinkets in the bustling marketplace. Then your business could, in theory, continue much more smoothly and independently after Thomas's death. You already had your own legal standing, your own commercial network, your own reputation. You weren't just Thomas the baker's widow. You were Margaret the alewife, a known and perhaps respected figure in the urban economy. But please, don't for a moment get the idea that it was some kind of feminist paradise for entrepreneurial widows in medieval towns. Far, far from it. Those guilds, while they might grudgingly offer a temporary lifeline to a member's widow, they were, at their core, fiercely protective, intensely conservative, and almost exclusively male-dominated institutions. Their primary overriding goal was to protect the economic interests, the standards, and the monopolies of their existing male members. So, while they might allow you, the widow, to keep your late husband's shop open for a bit, usually under their watchful eye, there would almost certainly be strings attached. Lots of strings. You might be explicitly barred from taking on any new apprentices, which effectively ensured that your business would slowly dwindle over time as your existing workforce aged or moved on. You might be required to pay higher guild fees than a male master craftsman, or be subject to more frequent and nitpicking inspections of your wares or workshop. You would almost certainly face subtle, or often not so subtle, harassment, undermining, and unfair competition from other guild members who resented a woman operating in their ranks, perhaps undercutting their prices or simply existing, as a reminder that women could in fact be competent in business. And the pressure to remarry, oh, it was just as intense for you, Margaret the urban widow, as it was for Lady Eleanor the noble widow, though perhaps for slightly different, more economically pragmatic reasons. If you were successfully running a viable business, the guildmasters would be very keen for you to marry again, and to marry wisely, from their perspective. That meant marrying another man from the same craft, perhaps a promising journeyman looking for a chance to become a master by marrying into an established workshop, or another widowed master craftsman looking to consolidate his business by acquiring yours. This would ensure that the business, its skilled workforce, its tools, and its valuable clientele all stayed safely within the guild's control and didn't leak out to an outsider. If you dared to refuse their strong recommendations, or, heaven forbid, if you chose to remarry an outsider, a man from a different trade, or even a man from outside the town altogether, you could find your precious guild privileges revoked almost overnight. Your right to trade within the town walls could be stripped away. Your workshop could be forcibly closed, your tools confiscated, your business acumen, your years of hard work alongside Thomas, your desperate attempts to provide for your children. All of it was ultimately secondary to the guild's unyielding desire to maintain its monopoly, its internal hierarchy, and its deeply entrenched patriarchal order. You were, in many ways, still just a temporary custodian of your husband's economic legacy, holding it in trust until another suitable man could take it over. Now, let's not forget about where you're actually living in this bustling medieval town. It probably wasn't a picturesque, half-timbered cottage with roses round the door, despite what some romantic paintings might suggest. A medieval town was a teeming, jostling, incredibly crowded and profoundly unsanitary place. You're likely living in a narrow, multi-story, timber-framed house, perhaps with your workshop or shop on the ground floor, and your cramped living quarters above. These houses were built cheek by jowl, often leaning precariously over the dark, narrow, muddy, and unpaved streets below. Personal space? Forget about it. Privacy? A laughable luxury. The noise is incessant, a never-ending cacophony from before dawn until well after dusk. You've got vendors shouting their wares at the top of their lungs. Fresh herring, get your fresh herring here. You've got the iron-shod wheels of heavy carts and wagons clattering and groaning over uneven cobblestones. If your street is even lucky enough to have cobblestones, many were just dirt tracks. You've got dogs barking, children screaming, neighbors arguing, and the constant din of crafts being plied. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the whine of a carpenter's saw, the rhythmic thud of a weaver's loom. It's a symphony of urban chaos. And the smells. Oh, the magnificent, unforgettable medieval urban perfume. It's a rich bouquet, a complex blend you'll never quite get out of your nostrils. There's the underlying bass note of rotting garbage, because refuse was often just piled in the streets or in designated, but overflowing middens. Add to that the pungent aroma of animal dung from the pigs, chickens, and other livestock that often roamed freely, even in larger towns. Then there's the charming medieval habit of simply chucking human waste, your chamber pot contents, out of an upstairs window directly into the street below. If you were a considerate householder, you might shout a warning of "Gardez-le," from the French gare de l'eau, beware of the water, before you tossed it, but don't count on it. Mix in the ever-present smoke from thousands of wood or coal fires used for heating and cooking, and the specific, often nauseating, stenches from various industries. The ammonia reek from tanneries curing leather with urine, the coppery smell of blood from nearby slaughterhouses, the chemical tang from dyers' workshops using all sorts of unpleasant substances. It's a wonder anyone had a functioning sense of smell left after a week in a medieval town. You just got used to it. Or you tried to. In these crowded, filthy conditions, with open drains, if any drains at all, and contaminated water sources, disease was your constant, unwelcome neighbor. Dysentery, typhus, influenza, smallpox, measles, various fevers, and agues of unknown origin. They swept through medieval towns with horrifying regularity, especially in the hotter summer months or during times of famine when people were weakened. If an epidemic hit, you, as a widow, perhaps already worn down by overwork, stress, and poor nutrition, were particularly vulnerable. And if you had young children, keeping them alive and healthy in such an environment, protecting them from the myriad infections that lurked in every gutter and every shared well, was a daily desperate battle that many mothers, tragically, lost. Now, what if your late husband, Thomas, wasn't a prosperous master craftsman with his own workshop and a position in the guild? What if he was just a journeyman himself, working for wages, or a simple day laborer, a boatman on the river, a porter carrying goods in the market, his income precarious and dependent on the next job. When he died, he might have left you with almost nothing. No workshop to continue, no valuable tools to sell, no stock in trade. Just a rented room or two in a crowded, squalid tenement building, perhaps shared with other families and a handful of hungry, bewildered children. Your dower in this heartbreaking case might be a pathetic share of a few meager household possessions, a cracked cooking pot, a couple of threadbare blankets, his old, worn-out boots. Not much to build a new future on, is it? For these poorest urban widows, life was a relentless, desperate scramble for any kind of work, any way to earn a few pennies to buy a bit of bread or fuel, taking in washing for wealthier households, if you could get the work, and if you could find a spot by the often polluted town river, and if you could afford the scarce and expensive soap, mending clothes for others, your fingers aching as you stitched late into the night by the flickering light of a single precious tallow candle, spinning thread for weavers, the spindle a constant companion, the pay a pittance for hours of labor, working as a domestic servant in a tavern or in a larger merchant or noble household within the town for pitiful wages, long hours, and often harsh treatment or unwelcome advances from the master or his sons. Wet nursing was another grim option for some widows, particularly if you'd recently had a child of your own who had died, or whom you could leave with equally impoverished relatives in the countryside. You would nurse the baby of a wealthier urban woman who couldn't, or more often simply wouldn't, breastfeed her own child. It was emotionally wrenching work, bonding with a child who was not your own, knowing they would eventually be taken from you. And it often meant neglecting your own surviving children, or even contributing to their malnutrition because your own milk was going to another. And yes, for some women, when all other avenues were exhausted, the only alternative to slow starvation for themselves and their children was prostitution. Medieval towns, for all their outward piety, had their designated areas, their stews or red light districts, where such activities were usually tolerated, sometimes even licensed and taxed by the town authorities. It was a dangerous, degrading, and disease-ridden life, offering only the slimmest hope of survival. But for a woman utterly alone and with no other means of support, it might have seemed like the only desperate choice left in a world that offered her so few others. Charitable institutions, as we've mentioned, did exist in the larger towns and cities. There were hospitals, like the famous St. Bartholomew's or St. Thomas's in London, which, in the medieval period, weren't just for treating the acutely sick as we think of them today. They were also, and perhaps primarily, places of refuge and care for the chronically ill, the disabled, the elderly poor, and the destitute, a category into which many widows undoubtedly fell, some religious orders and man, while wealthy merchants or guild members, often in their wills, as a way of ensuring prayers for their souls and smoothing their path to heaven, endowed almshouses. These were small institutions specifically designed to provide shelter, a bit of food, and a communal, often prayerful life for a limited number of deserving poor people, often specified as poor widows of good character, or decayed gentlewomen who have fallen on hard times. Getting into one of these places, well, it was like winning the medieval lottery. There were never ever enough beds, enough resources to meet the overwhelming need. You'd probably need powerful patrons, glowing references from your parish priest, or an incredible amount of luck and persistence. You might spend years on a waiting list, surviving hand to mouth by begging or casual labor, before a precious spot finally opened up. And even then, life in an almshouse was often strictly regulated, with compulsory chapel attendance, rules about behavior, and little personal freedom. But it was a roof and a meal which was more than many had. So, the urban widow, our Margaret, her world is one of constant hustle, of sharp elbows and sharper wits. If she's among the fortunate few, she's battling to keep a small business afloat against a tide of male competitors, restrictive guild practices, and her own crushing grief and exhaustion. If she's not so lucky, she's battling for the next crust of bread, the next bit of poorly paid, demeaning work in a city teeming with both elusive opportunity and ever-present danger. She's surrounded by thousands of other souls, yet she can be utterly, terrifyingly alone in her daily struggle for survival. Her dower might be a craftsman's tools and a dusty workshop instead of a windswept field of barley, but the underlying bone-deep precariousness of her situation, that's a common thread that binds her tightly to her rural sisters in sorrow. It's still, fundamentally, a man's world, and she's just trying to find or desperately claw out a small, defensible space within its unforgiving walls, a space where she and her children might just manage to survive another day, another week, another long and hungry urban night. We've waded through the murky waters of medieval law, picked our way across the economic battlegrounds, and felt the relentless ache of physical toil that defined so much of a medieval widow's existence, whether she lived in a grand manor, a humble cottage, or a crowded urban tenement. But what about the burdens that weren't so easily seen? The invisible chains? The way society looked at you, Margaret or Eleanor? The way it whispered about you, judged you? And the silent, often lonely, frequently terrifying landscape of your own heart and mind? This is where the true, soul-crushing weight of widowhood often lay. A burden far heavier than any sack of grain or bundle of firewood. The very moment your husband breathed his last, you didn't just lose a life partner, a companion, a provider, or even, perhaps, a master. You underwent a profound and often deeply unsettling social transformation. You stepped out of the clearly defined, socially understood, and generally accepted role of wife. A role that, for all its own constraints and subordinations, came with a certain place, a certain protection, a certain identity, and into the much more ambiguous, much more vulnerable, and often perilous category of widow. And medieval society, let me tell you, had a lot of very strong, often contradictory, and deeply anxious thoughts about women who weren't safely and visibly under the direct authority of a living father or a husband. You were a loose cannon in their eyes, a potential problem. The church, that colossal, all-pervasive institution that shaped every aspect of medieval life from cradle to grave, had its own very specific and very demanding ideal for you. The vir vidua, the true widow. This wasn't just a description, it was a prescription, a moral imperative. The vir vidua was the woman who, upon the death of her husband, embraced her new state, not as a disaster, but as a unique spiritual calling. She was to become a living model of chastity, unwavering piety, and sober, selfless devotion. Her primary purpose now was to mourn her departed husband, ideally, for the rest of her natural life, or at least until she was very, very old. She was to pray ceaselessly for his soul, which was almost certainly languishing in the fiery torments of purgatory, and desperately needed all the spiritual help it could get to reach paradise. She was to dedicate herself to charitable works, tending the sick, feeding the poor, embroidering altar cloths for the church. She was to live a quiet, almost nun-like existence, withdrawn from the frivolous vanities and dangerous temptations of the secular world. Think of figures from the scriptures, like Anna the prophetess in the Gospel of Luke, who after 7 years of marriage, lived as a widow to the age of 84, never leaving the temple, but worshiping night and day with fasting and prayer. That was the gold standard. That was what you were supposed to aspire to. And this ideal, it wasn't just a gentle suggestion. It was pushed, relentlessly. Influential church fathers, theologians like St. Jerome and St. Augustine, whose writings from centuries earlier were still the bedrock of medieval Christian thought, had penned some incredibly harsh and frankly quite misogynistic things about widows who even dared to contemplate remarrying. St. Jerome, in particular, was scathing. He basically accused any widow who sought a second husband of being driven by uncontrollable lust, of shamefully forgetting her dear departed spouse, whose place in the bed was barely cold, of callously neglecting her spiritual duties and even the welfare of her own children. He painted a picture of the remarried widow as somehow tainted, sullied, spiritually second class, a creature of base appetite rather than lofty devotion. This kind of deeply ingrained thinking permeated medieval society at every level, from the pronouncements of bishops to the gossip of village alewives. So, on the one hand, as a widow, you are presented as an object of pity, a figure deserving of communal care and Christian charity. The poor widow, like the orphan and the stranger, was a category of person that everyone was biblically enjoined to help. It was a Christian duty. Protecting the widow was a sign of a just and godly society. But, and it's a very, very big but, as we've seen before. On the other hand, an independent widow, especially one who was relatively young, perhaps still physically attractive, and most dangerously of all, in control of property or wealth, and who chose not to remarry immediately, or at all, and wasn't rushing off to the nearest convent to be safely cloistered away, such a woman could be seen as deeply problematic, highly suspicious, a woman without a husband to guide her, without a father to command her, without an adult son to control her property in her name. What on earth was she up to? She had property, maybe. She had a degree of freedom of movement, a level of legal agency, however circumscribed, that married women lacked. This made some people, many people, very uncomfortable, very unsettled indeed. A woman at large. What a terrifying thought. You see this deep societal ambivalence, this mixture of prescribed pity and underlying suspicion, reflected vividly in the popular culture of the time. Those body-irreverent medieval stories, the fablio, absolutely loved to feature widows. And they weren't usually the saintly, perpetually grieving, praying for their husband's soul types. Oh no, the widow in a fablio was often portrayed as lusty, cunning, worldly wise, and overwhelmingly eager to get her hands on a new man, or several, and usually depicted as cleverly outsmarting everyone around her, especially foolish old men or youths. Think of Geoffrey Chaucer's unforgettable wife of Bath, 5 times widowed, proudly displaying her extensive marital experience, and her wealth acquired from those deceased husbands, and openly, enthusiastically, on the hunt for husband number 6. While she's a magnificent, vibrant, and wonderfully subversive literary character, she also perfectly plays into that enduring stereotype of the experienced, somewhat dangerous, sexually assertive, and economically astute widow that both fascinated and profoundly worried the medieval male imagination. She was a force of nature, and a little bit terrifying for it. And these weren't just harmless literary tropes confined to the pages of manuscripts or the stages of traveling players. These stereotypes, these deeply ingrained societal assumptions about what widows were really like, they had real, tangible, and often devastating teeth in the real world. If society was already primed to see an unattached woman, particularly one with some experience of life, as potentially volatile or inherently deceitful, or overly concerned with worldly pleasures, it made your everyday life as a widow infinitely harder. If you were a widow trying to run a business, as our Margaret was, and you had to be firm and decisive with your male employees, or drive a hard bargain with your male suppliers, you weren't being lauded as a competent and astute manager. You were far more likely to be dismissed and denigrated as a shrew, a scold, an uppity woman who didn't know her place. If you enjoyed a bit of social life, perhaps attended a village festival, shared a friendly conversation, and a cup of ale, or even, God forbid, laughed a little too loudly with a man who wasn't a close relative, you weren't just being pleasantly sociable. You were immediately suspected of being forward, loose, light-minded, possibly even adulterous in your heart, if not yet indeed. Your every action, your every word, your very demeanor was scrutinized, judged, and often maliciously misinterpreted through this warped lens of suspicion. Your reputation. As a widow, it was an incredibly fragile, almost gossamer thing, and yet it was incredibly, vitally important. Any hint of scandal, any whiff of impropriety, however unfounded, could be utterly disastrous. It could affect not just your personal social standing, but your economic survival. Who would want to trade with a disreputable woman? Your children's future marriage prospects. No one wanted to ally their family with scandal. Even your legal rights if you were involved in any property disputes or other court cases. A woman of doubtful character was far less likely to be believed or treated fairly by an all-male court. You had to be constantly, exhaustingly, on your guard. You had to be hyper-aware of how your every action, your most innocent gesture, your most casual word might be perceived or deliberately misconstrued by a watchful and often censorious community. It was like walking on eggshells all day, every day. It was an exercise in perpetual self-monitoring, in carefully curating a public image of unimpeachable virtue and sober respectability that must have been utterly draining. This pervasive suspicion of independent women, particularly those who, through widowhood, found themselves in control of property or possessed a degree of economic autonomy, was a deep-seated anxiety in the patriarchal structure of medieval society. A woman who wasn't directly answerable to a man, a father, a husband, a brother, an adult son, was an anomaly, a deviation from the natural order of things as they saw it. And anomalies, deviations, these are often feared, or at least profoundly distrusted. This undercurrent of suspicion could easily, and often did, curdle into outright accusations, especially if you, the widow, were perceived as being too successful in your business, too outspoken in your opinions, too resistant to male advice or control, or just different in any way that made your neighbors uncomfortable. And in the later medieval period, and certainly moving into the early modern era, when the terrifying witch panics began to take hold across Europe, who were often the prime targets for these horrific accusations, disproportionately, they were elderly women, poor women, women on the margins of society, and yes, very frequently, widows, women who lived alone perhaps with only a cat for company, women who might be a bit eccentric, a bit reclusive, women who perhaps possessed a traditional knowledge of herbs and healing remedies, knowledge that in a climate of fear and superstition could easily be twisted by malicious accusers into evidence of malevolent witchcraft and consorting with the devil. The lonely, perhaps somewhat embittered elderly widow in her little cottage at the edge of the village. She was, tragically, an almost perfect scapegoat when unexplained misfortunes, a failed crop, a sick cow, a child, as illness, struck the community. Her vulnerability, her otherness, made her an easy target for collective fear and blame. And then, beyond all these external societal pressures, there was the inner world. The silent, often unrecorded, deeply personal, emotional landscape of the medieval widow. We've talked about grief, that immediate, overwhelming, crashing wave of sorrow and loss. But what about the long, slow, grinding ache of loneliness that so often followed, stretching out for months, for years, perhaps for the rest of her life? Even if your marriage wasn't a grand passion, even if it was primarily a practical arrangement, as so many medieval marriages were, your husband was likely your primary companion, the person with whom you shared the daily rhythms of your life. The small joys, the constant anxieties, his absence, his death, left a void that wasn't just economic or social. It was deeply, profoundly personal. Imagine the long, dark evenings after the children, if you have them, are finally asleep. The house is quiet, terrifyingly quiet, except for the sigh of the wind in the eaves, or the distant mournful barking of a village dog. Who do you talk to then about your worries, your small triumphs, the thousand tiny details and observations that make up a human life? In a society where women's friendships, while undoubtedly important and a source of solace, were often considered secondary to the primary bond of marriage, and where opportunities for women to gather and confide outside the watchful eyes of men might be limited, the loss of that central confidant, that daily partner, could be devastating, leading to a profound sense of isolation. The surviving letters of some literate medieval women, like those of Alessandra Strozzi, that remarkable 15th-century Florentine widow we've mentioned before, give us poignant, invaluable glimpses into this hidden inner world. She was widowed, relatively young, and remained so for decades, tirelessly managing her family's complex business affairs, desperately trying to secure advantageous marriages for her children, and navigating the treacherous waters of Florentine politics that had led to her son's exile. Her letters to these absent sons are filled with expressions of deep maternal love and constant anxiety for their welfare, but they also reveal her own weariness, her fears for the family's fortunes, her crushing sense of responsibility, and yes, her profound and enduring loneliness. "I have no other good in this world but you," she writes to them with heartbreaking candor, "and to live for you and for your affairs, and to pray God for you." Her long life became a testament to her unwavering devotion to her children and her family's lineage, but the immense personal cost, the decades of solitude and unceasing worry, are palpable between the lines of her elegant, sorrowful script. There's also the subtle but significant loss of identity that came with widowhood. In the rigidly hierarchical and patriarchal medieval world, a woman's identity was overwhelmingly, almost entirely defined by her relationship to the men in her life. She was, first and foremost, someone's daughter. Then she became someone's wife. Then, perhaps, someone's mother. When her husband died, the central defining title of wife of was abruptly and irrevocably erased. She became, in the formal language of the time, the relict of her late husband. Literally, that which is left behind, a remainder, an echo. This civil death, as some perceptive historians have termed it, wasn't just a matter of legal status or economic standing. It was a profound psychological shift. Who were you now, in your own right? Your place in the complex social hierarchy, your very sense of self, even your name, as you were often known in the community primarily as Goodwife John or Lady Robert, your own given name almost an afterthought. All of it was thrown into question, into a state of uncomfortable, unsettling flux. You had to, in a sense, reinvent yourself, redefine your place in a world that wasn't particularly interested in helping you do so. And the fear. Oh, the fear must have been a constant, unwelcome companion, a cold shadow clinging to your every thought and action. Fear of abject poverty, of not being able to feed your children. Fear of exploitation by grasping relatives or unscrupulous officials. Fear for your children's physical safety and their future prospects in a harsh world. Fear of illness, because if you, the widow, the sole remaining pillar of your small household, fell sick and couldn't work or manage your affairs, who would step in? Who would care for you or for your dependents? Fear of the unknown future, in a world that offered so few certainties, so few safety nets, especially for a woman navigating its treacherous paths alone. This undercurrent of anxiety, this daily burden of apprehension must have been exhausting. Yet, it's absolutely crucial to remember, amidst all his gloom and doom, that medieval widows were not just passive, weeping victims of circumstance. They were, in so many cases, survivors. They had to be. They developed, often out of sheer necessity, incredible reserves of resilience, resourcefulness, ingenuity, and frequently, a steely, unyielding determination. They learned, often the hard way, to navigate the treacherous currents of their society, to play the limited hand they were dealt with as much skill and cunning as they could muster. They found strength in their religious faith, a deep and abiding comfort for many. They found profound motivation in their love for their children, for whose sake they would endure almost anything. They found solace and practical support in their communities, in the kindness of neighbors, the loyalty of kinsfolk, the solidarity of other women, when those communities were supportive and not hostile. And ultimately, many found a surprising strength and capability within themselves, qualities I'd never have known they possessed until tragedy forced them to the surface. Some, like the formidable Paston women, became, as we've seen, astute legal strategists and highly effective estate managers, holding their own against powerful male adversaries. Some, like the extraordinarily gifted Christine de Pizan, who, after being widowed young with 3 small children and a mountain of her late husband's crushing debts, courageously chose the then almost unheard-of path of becoming Europe's first professional female writer to support herself and her family, turning her grief and hardship into powerful, enduring, creative, and intellectual work that challenged the misogyny of her age. These women, with their access to literacy, resources, and a certain social standing, were undoubtedly exceptional, their stories preserved because of their unique circumstances. However, for every well-documented Margaret Paston or Christine de Pizan, there were thousands upon thousands, millions even, of anonymous, unlettered widows whose daily existence was a relentless, unrecorded struggle against poverty, exploitation, and the myriad constraints of their society. Their lives weren't celebrated in heroic chronicles or debated in learned treatises. Their struggles were etched not in ink on parchment, but in the deep furrows of the fields they tilled, in the painful calluses on their hard-working hands, in the worried, tired lines etched around their eyes. The weight of the widow's weeds, it was indeed more than just the physical weight of the somber, scratchy cloth. It was the crushing weight of societal expectation, of legal vulnerability, of pervasive economic uncertainty, of profound, often unbearable loneliness, and of a fragile reputation that could be shattered in an instant by a careless word or a malicious rumor. But it was a weight that many medieval women bore with a quiet, stubborn dignity, and an astonishing, often overlooked strength that truly deserves not just our pity, but our deepest admiration. Their inner worlds were no doubt complex, a turbulent, ever-shifting tapestry woven from threads of sorrow, fear, anger, resilience, determination, and perhaps in rare, fleeting, hard-won moments, even a flicker of precarious, fiercely guarded independence. And it is in acknowledging that complexity, that interplay of suffering and strength, that we come closest to understanding the true, multifaceted reality of their lives. So, we've journeyed together through the many shadowed valleys, and across the few scattered sunlit uplands of medieval widowhood. We've attempted to see through the eyes of Lady Eleanor in her drafty, imposing manner, battling for her dower, her autonomy, and the future of her children against a phalanx of grasping relatives and powerful, indifferent lords. We've walked beside Goodwife Agnes in the muddy, unforgiving fields, her back perpetually aching, her spirit often weary to the bone, but her fierce determination to feed her hungry children somehow, someway, remaining stubbornly unbent. We've navigated the noisy, perilous, and often stinking streets of the medieval town with Margaret, the urban widow, desperately trying to keep her late husband's craft alive against the odds, or simply to find enough scraps of work, enough morsels of food, to survive another day, another week, in a world teeming with both fleeting opportunity and ever-present danger. We've felt the invisible, crushing weight of societal judgment, the sting of cruel, demeaning stereotypes, and the profound, gnawing ache of loneliness that so often settled in the quiet, unguarded hours of a widow's long night. It's a grim, often heartbreaking picture, isn't it? A relentless, almost overwhelming litany of hardship, vulnerability, legal disadvantage, and social exclusion. And it's very easy, perhaps even natural, to conclude that for any medieval woman, the death of her husband was an unmitigated disaster, a devastating sentence to a life of unending misery, relentless struggle, and profound marginalization. And for many, for vast numbers whose stories are lost to the silence of history, it undoubtedly, tragically was exactly that. But is that the entire story? Is it only and always a tale of victimhood, of passive suffering? Or, if we look closer, if we listen more carefully to the faint whispers that echo down to us through the centuries, from surviving letters, wills, court records, and even folk tales, can we perhaps find something more? Perhaps some unexpected glimmers of agency, of remarkable resilience, even of opportunity, however severely constrained, however perilously grasped? One of the great and often overlooked paradoxes of medieval widowhood, particularly for women who belonged to the property-owning classes, whether noble, gentry, or even prosperous urban merchant families, was that this very state of bereavement could, in a strange and often unintended way, offer them a degree of legal and economic independence that was utterly, categorically unavailable to them as married women. Remember the pervasive legal doctrine of coverture, which dominated English common law and had parallels in many other European legal systems. Under coverture, a married woman was largely, almost entirely, subsumed under her husband's legal identity. She was, in the eyes of the law, a femme covert, a covered woman. She generally couldn't own land or significant property in her own name, though she could hold it jointly with him or have property settled on her for her use. She couldn't make legally binding contracts on her own. She couldn't sue or be sued in court independently of her husband. He controlled her property, even property she might have brought into the marriage as her dowry. He controlled her earnings if she had any. He controlled, to a very significant degree, even her physical person. But when her husband died, poof, like a dark, heavy cloak being suddenly lifted, cover, toure ended. As a widow, you were now considered a femme sole in the eyes of the law, a woman alone. And with that status, however unwelcome its cause, came certain legal capacities. You could, in theory, own and manage your dower property, that precious one-third life interest, in your own right. you could make a legally valid will, disposing of your personal property as you saw fit, though not usually your dower lands, which reverted to your husband's heirs. You could enter into contracts, make purchases, take out loans, if anyone was brave enough to lend to you. You could appear in court in your own name, to defend your interests or to pursue claims against others. This wasn't some enlightened gift of liberation from a suddenly feminist medieval legal system. It was a practical legal necessity, because you were no longer under a husband's direct authority, and someone had to be legally responsible for your actions and your property. But it did, undeniably, open up a space, however small, however fraught with peril, for a degree of female agency that had been denied to you throughout your married life. Of course, as we've seen in painstaking detail, exercising that newfound legal agency was another matter entirely. You still faced a deeply patriarchal legal system, staffed entirely by men, operating according to laws and customs largely written by men for the benefit of men. You still faced pervasive societal prejudice, and the very real threat of exploitation by those stronger or more ruthless than yourself. But the potential for a degree of self-determination, for making your own decisions about your own life and property, was there, in a way it simply hadn't been before. And some women, the determined, the resourceful, the lucky ones, they seized it with both hands. Think again of those formidable Paston women from 15th century Norfolk, Agnes and Margaret. Their surviving letters, a treasure trove for historians, paint a vivid picture of how these noble and de-gentry widows could become absolutely central figures in the management and preservation of their families' fortunes. They weren't just passively holding on to their dower lands. They were active, often aggressive estate managers, directing agricultural operations, negotiating leases with tenants, engaging in incredibly complex and protracted litigation against powerful rivals who sought to dispossess them, raising ransoms for captive family members, strategizing for their children's advantageous marriages, and even, in Margaret's case, organizing the armed defense of a castle. They were, in every sense of the word, active players in the often brutal game of late medieval English society, wielding what power and influence they possessed with considerable skill, courage, and often a good deal of ruthless tenacity. Or consider again those urban widows, our Margarets, who, against the odds, managed to successfully continue their late husbands' businesses in the competitive and often hostile environment of the medieval town. The records of town guilds, though often frustratingly sparse and biased when it comes to documenting the activities of women, do provide us with tantalizing instances of widows continuing as bakers, brewers, a trade in which women were particularly prominent, weavers, tailors, chandlers, merchants, and more. They were employing journeymen, they were training apprentices, sometimes even female apprentices, passing on their skills to another generation of women. They were contributing to the vibrant economic life of their towns, sometimes for many years after their husbands' deaths. They had to be incredibly shrewd, endlessly hard-working, and masters of diplomacy to navigate the restrictive guild regulations and the resentment of their male competitors. But they were, in their own way, independent economic actors, carving out a niche for themselves and their families, even for peasant widows, like our goodwife Agnes, whose lives were so often defined by unrelenting hardship. The picture, while undeniably grim, might have contained occasional, tiny, flickering chinks of light, small acts of agency. A widow who, through sheer back-breaking labor and perhaps the crucial help of her older children, or a few supportive neighbors, managed to hold on to her dower land and make it productive, had a degree of food security, and a recognized place in the village community, however humble, that a completely landless and destitute woman utterly lacked. She might, as we've noted, brew a little extra ale from her barley harvest to sell to her neighbors for a few precious pennies. She might spin surplus wool from her, or perhaps the Lord's sheep into thread to trade for other necessities. These were small, almost invisible, acts of economic self-reliance, born of desperate necessity, but significant nonetheless in a world that offered so few opportunities for peasant women to control their own economic destinies, and the Church's rather demanding ideal of the pious chaste vir vidua, while undeniably restrictive and often used to control women's lives and choices, it also, paradoxically, offered a certain recognized and even respected social niche. A widow who genuinely, or even strategically embraced a life of visible devotion, conspicuous charity, and unwavering chastity could find a measure of meaning, a supportive community, particularly within religious confraternities or third orders, and even a degree of protection under the Church's powerful wing. Some wealthy and devout widows became significant patrons of religious art and architecture, endowed chantries where priests would say masses for their late husbands' souls, and, not coincidentally, for their own, or even founded and endowed small religious communities, hospitals for the poor, or almshouses for other deserving widows. This wasn't freedom in any modern secular sense of the word, but it was a socially sanctioned path that offered spiritual fulfillment, a degree of public esteem, and for some, a way to exercise a different kind of influence and leave a lasting legacy. The decision not to remarry, if a widow possessed the financial means, the social standing, and the sheer strength of will to successfully resist the often overwhelming pressures from family and feudal superiors, could also be, in itself, a profound act of asserting autonomy. To choose to remain single, to manage her own property without the interference of a new husband, to control her own destiny and that of her children as much as medieval society would allow, this was a radical, almost defiant act in a world that generally saw an unmarried woman, unless she was safely cloistered as a nun, as an anomaly, a problem, a temptation. It undoubtedly took immense courage, a formidable reputation, and often powerful male allies who were willing to support her choice. It certainly wasn't an option available to most widows, especially those further down the social scale. But for those few who could achieve it, it represented a significant, if often precarious and lonely form of hard-won independence. Of course, we must always be incredibly careful not to romanticize this, not to overstate these glimmers of agency, and paint a falsely rosy picture of medieval widowhood. For every resourceful Paston widow who successfully defended her castle, for every urban craftswoman who managed to keep her business afloat, for every pious dowager who found respect and fulfillment in charitable works, there were countless, nameless others whose lives were defined by unrelenting poverty, brutal exploitation, crushing loneliness, and silent despair. The fundamental, deeply entrenched patriarchal structures of medieval society were overwhelmingly stacked against women in general, and often doubly so against widows, who lacked the immediate protection and legal identity afforded by a husband. Their legal rights, even when enshrined in charters like Magna Carta, were often conditional, difficult to enforce, and easily undermined by those with more power. Their economic opportunities were severely limited by custom, by guild restrictions, and by their own lack of access to education and capital. Their social standing was perpetually precarious, their reputations fragile and easily besmirched. The long, dark shadow of medieval widowhood was indeed pervasive and oppressive. It affected every conceivable aspect of a woman's life, from where she lived and what she ate, to how she dressed and who she was permitted to talk to, from what choices she could make about her own body and her own future, to how her very soul was judged by God and by society. It meant a life of constant vigilance, of endless negotiation with a largely unsympathetic world, of perpetual awareness of her own inherent vulnerability in a system not designed for her benefit. But within that deep shadow, women lived. They loved their children with a fierce, protective devotion. They found solace and strength in their faith, or in the small fleeting comforts of daily life. A shared song, a moment of laughter with a friend, the warmth of a fire on a cold night. They formed bonds of friendship and mutual support with other women, creating informal networks of care and resilience that are often invisible in the official historical records. They worked, they managed, they schemed, they prayed, they endured. They were not just passive recipients of misfortune, not just weeping figures in black robes. They were, in so many unrecorded ways, active agents in their own survival, however severely limited their options, however crushing the obstacles might have been. When we try to understand why it sucked to be a medieval widow, we are, in a very real sense, trying to recover these lost voices, these forgotten lives from the dustbin of history. We are attempting to see beyond the dry statistics of dour lands and mortality rates, beyond the prescriptive texts of law and theology, to glimpse the complex, contradictory, often heartbreaking but also surprisingly resilient human heart beating beneath the widow's somber weeds. It's a story of immense, almost unimaginable hardship, yes, there is no denying that. But it is also, in its own quiet, often unsung and deeply moving way, a story of the enduring, astonishing strength of the human spirit when confronted with overwhelming, seemingly insurmountable adversity. And as you let these final, perhaps unsettling thoughts settle around you, as the image of these myriad medieval women, noble and peasant, urban and rural, defiant and devout, crushed by circumstance or quietly triumphant against the odds, begins to fade into the welcoming mists of your encroaching sleep, try to remember them. Remember their manifold struggles, yes, for they were real and they were brutal. But remember their resilience too, for in their forgotten, often deliberately obscured lives, there are profound, if sobering, lessons for us all. About survival, about dignity, about the enduring importance of compassion, and about the quiet, often uncelebrated courage it takes to simply keep going, day after weary day, when the world itself seems determined to grind you into the dust. Perhaps, after all, the greatest, most enduring suck factor of being a medieval widow was not just the individual hardship itself, a burden heavy enough to break any soul, but the fact that their incredible multifaceted strength and their quiet, desperate resilience in the face of it all has so often been overlooked, undervalued, or simply forgotten by history. Until now, as you finally drift gently and peacefully to sleep. And so we draw the heavy, time-worn velvet curtains on the life, or rather, the many challenging, often heartbreaking, but surprisingly resilient lives of the medieval widow. A journey through sorrow and hardship, yes, but also, I hope, a testament to the enduring, often unsung strength found in quiet, shadowed corners of our shared human history. Thank you for staying with us through this very deep, very dark, and very long exploration. If the tales of these remarkable, long-suffering women have given you something to ponder as you drift towards dreamland, or perhaps even a strange sense of perspective on your own worries, maybe consider a like or a subscribe, so you don't miss our next foray into the sleepy, shadowy, and always fascinating side of the past. Until then, sleep soundly. May your own path be clear of legal quagmires, your burdens demonstrably light, and your dreams entirely free of feudal obligations and grasping in-laws. Good night.